right, everybody, here we go at a lightning quick review of the Stuart Dynasty. We're moving into the age of absolutism, where we have kings who are king by divine right. Excuse me there, let me adjust everyone. And the first up is going to be the Stuart Dynasty of England. And what makes them different is, after Columbus discovered the New World, the resources that are going to be taken from it in the transatlantic trade in the period of mercantilism, Northwest Europe is going to dominate the globe until the early 1900s, till the end of World War I. And as changes in military technology and the cost of fighting wars increases, that kind of dictates this. It's no longer knights clinking and clanking in armor. It's the monarch who has the most soldiers and can transport them from point A to point B the fastest that is going to be successful. And so as Europeans begin to establish overseas colonies in the Americas and Africa, it gives them a vein of money, access to money to make this possible. And it's going to be monarchs who can secure a financial base where they are not dependent upon the nobles or a parliament, will become the sole and dominant rulers of their respective countries. So first up, we have the English. And at this time, we have English King Henry VIII, who will found the Church of England. He will break away from the Catholic Church when the Pope will not annul a marriage of his to a lady named Catherine of Aragon. And so he founds the Anglican Church to where he is the head of it and not the Pope. And Henry worked with Parliament. They was kind of a good old boy network. And so when he needed an increase in taxes, they normally almost always voted to implement them. They just enjoyed being part of the process. They enjoyed being asked. When Henry dies, he gives way to Queen Elizabeth I. Now, Queen Elizabeth enjoyed the same arrangement with Parliament. She was a woman at first. She was a woman, not at first. She was a woman, but at first, they didn't know how to handle her. But she guides Parliament with a firm and a strong hand. She deals with them the same way her father did. But her not having an heir brings problems. The closest direct in line descendant to the English throne was the King of Scotland. James I of Scotland will become King James of England. And he's more than happy to leave Scotland. He comes down and he's in London. He's like, this is going to be great. I'm out of Scotland. And he finds out that he gets there, things aren't so rosy. He inherits a massively large debt and a nation that's religiously divided. There were still some people who wanted to be Catholic. There were the new Protestant Anglicans and an ultra-strict group known as the Puritans. And so, as James comes in, he claims that he was ready to rule and abide by English law and tradition. And then he finds out that Parliament only meets when he summons them. He's like, what? You guys only meet when I call you? This is great, so I'm never going to call you. And he doesn't, and this creates tension between him and his nobles. And he looks around and he sees that England is broke and they're fighting wars against Spain and France. So to make peace, he offers his son Charles as a hand in marriage to the Spanish princess. And the Spanish say no. And he says, well, okay. He offers his son's hand to the French princess. And when she says no, the Spanish are like, wait, you cannot do this. You cannot offer your son's hand in marriage to the French. He says, why not? You guys already said no. Not only were the Spanish and the French upset, but when Parliament asked what James was doing, what are you doing? You're trying to make peace with Catholics. What, are you a Catholic? You're a conspirator on the throne. He said, guys, we're broke. I'm trying to save us money. If my son can marry one of them, then we won't have so many problems. But Parliament doesn't buy it. And so James is going to try and find a way to get around making money without Parliament's consent. So he starts to charge an import tax. Any goods coming from anywhere in the world, even English colonies, had to pay a tax. And the king got all this money. Parliament was really upset by this because they were supposed to control his purse. And then the Puritans show up, and they are called that because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of any remnant, any at all, of anything that had to deal with Catholicism. And James doesn't really meet their expectations. Yeah, he wants to be a Puritan, but he's also kind of Catholic, and when he doesn't do exactly what they want, it begins to cause problems for himself and his descendants, namely his son, Charles I. And Charles is going to pick up ruling where his dad left off. And Charles began to believe in the policy that is a theme throughout our absolute monarchs, that he was king by divine right. He was king because God wanted him simply to be king. And he began to behave like that. When he wanted to do things, if you disagreed with him, you were thrown in jail. And he imprisoned nobles who disagreed with him, and he created new taxes to further his plans. And Congress hated this. But eventually, no matter what he tried, he could never make enough money to solve the English debt. So he's forced to call Congress. God, I keep saying Congress. He's forced to call Parliament. Parliament meets, and they said, okay, you haven't called us in a long time. So before we give you anything, you are going to sign the petition of right. And what that simply means is you cannot create taxes or you cannot throw people in prison without Parliament's consent. And he's like, but I'm the king, I can do what I want. They're like, no. Not here in England you can't. So Charles signs it and then quickly dismisses them. They're called the Short Parliament. He did it just to get what he wanted. And Parliament was angry. They had just gotten there, and then he turned around and sent them home, and they hadn't met in years. And so Charles is going to get a guy with a local Chapel Hill connection named Thomas Wentworth. Thomas Wentworth is going to run his budget. And he puts Charles on a strict spending plan. He says, Charles, you can't spend more than you take in. If you do this, we will be able to break the power of the nobles and you will be an absolute monarch. And for 11 years, things go fine. And then a war breaks out in Scotland. And when the Scots aren't so easily defeated, Charles runs out of money and he's forced to call Parliament. And they return and they're still angry at being dismissed. And they said, we're going to give you that money, but not until you agree to our terms. We don't trust you, so we're going to put provisions on there or we're not going to give it to you. And the king says, yeah, right, whatever. And then he loses a battle with the Scots. And he's like, oh my God, I really do need this money. So he has to listen to Parliament's demands. This will be known as the Long Parliament. They said one of the things that are going to happen is we cannot be dissolved without our consent, and we have to meet at least once every 3 years. Well, Charles says, who do you think you are, for God's sake? I am king. Who the heck do you people think you are? So Charles will lead British troops into Parliament, kicking off what's called the English Civil War, which lasts from 1642 to 1649. And the king led a group of guys known as the Cavaliers. They had this long, kind of curly hair, kind of like the Three Musketeers of France. They were military men, they were nobles, and so it should have been a quick victory. And they fight against a group of commoners known as the Roundheads with their boring bull haircut. So we have the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads, the peasants and the commoners. Well, it should have been an easy victory, except the Roundheads pick a Puritan leader named Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell turned out not to only be a military genius, but an organizational one as well. And after 7 long years of war, Charles I will lose, and he will become the first and the only English monarch to be beheaded. And so Parliament is going to dissolve the monarchy, which shocks everybody else in Europe. If the British can get rid of their king, what can they do to us? And they turn England into a commonwealth with Oliver Cromwell at their head. But Cromwell is a Puritan. He's great, but he's boring. There's no fun. There's no music. There's no dancing. Pubs are closed. Theaters are closed. And Cromwell said that everyone was dressed humbly in navy blue, black, or brown, kind of like Amish. And he said that there's freedom of worship as long as you are a Protestant. And the English are like, oh my God, this is so boring. And after about 10 years of this, people can't take it, and they're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Maybe we should bring a king back. And Cromwell dies in 1658, and Parliament votes to bring back Charles II, the rightful king who was up in Ireland at the time. And they reinstitute him. And Charles is a good-looking guy. He's a good political speaker. He could put on overalls and a Carhartt and go down to the local pub and drink beer and talk sports and power tools. Or he could put on a black tie dinner and entertain the rich and the famous. And Charles wants to unite people with this crazy thing known as religious tolerance. He's like, does it really matter, who you worship? But even his most close supporters said, as a royal, you can't be pro-Catholic and be pro-British at the same time. And he said, why not? And people find out that one of his best friends in the world was none other than the great absolute monarch, King Louis XIV of France. So Charles decides to avoid many of the confrontations with Parliament his dad and grandfather had, for the simple fact that he met with them and then he just did whatever he wanted. He did what they said. He agreed to what they said, and then he did his own thing. This eventually doesn't work. And he is going to die and give way to his brother, King James II, in 1685. Now, James was the spare. He never thought he would be king, and so he kind of always did his own thing. And he's blatantly pro-Catholic. They didn't like the way people treated his grandfather or his dad, so he just goes about doing what he wants. He abolishes laws without consulting Parliament. He replaced members who didn't agree with him, and he put loyal Catholics in their position, blatantly rubbing it in the noses of Parliament. And finally, he says he wants to be religiously tolerant, so he announces that any Catholic who wanted to worship should be able to do so. And all Anglican churches had to mention this to their congregation members. When 7 Anglican bishops do not, he has them imprisoned. And you can get away with a lot, but arresting somebody's church leader was too much. What James was trying to do was subjugate all British institutions, including the church, who he was now the head of, to his power. But jailing the bishops was just simply too much. So in 1688, Parliament invented his own daughter, a lady named Mary, and her husband William of Orange from the Netherlands, to come over and take the throne. As William and Mary reached the shore, it's called the Glorious Revolution, which wasn't super glorious or a revolution, but when they come to England, they have to sign the English Bill of Rights. which forever limits the power of the monarchy. It is the precursor of our own. But the civil liberties given out by the English Bill of Rights are only for the aristocratic and noble classes in England only, not the average everyday British person. So this is important because since then on, Parliament has been supreme over the monarchy. And a provision was written that if there is no heir, the king and the kingship will pass to the House of Hanover in Germany, who were Protestant. And in 1714 this happens, and from the House of Hanover we get King George I of England. He inherits a difficult position as the king. He couldn't speak English. He had a lot of power, but he really didn't know what was going on since he was German. So luckily he gets a guy. Here's William and Mary, nice long hair. This stern looking guy is King George. They will hire Robert Walpole, who was the first Prime Minister of England. And Walpole will get a group of advisors, this small cabinet we talk about each time. Very few small members who the king can meet with every single day. And Walpole told the cabinet they can disagree in private, but when a decision is made, they are all going to go out in public and support their king. And this is what happens. This props up this new fledgling kingship, and Parliament will come back. They are not a democratic or a representative institution, however. While it's a working government, the British guys do things mostly to benefit themselves. But as a result, with free speech and freedom of the press, at least for some people, they create a greater political unity that exists in few other places around the world. And as a result, the British, a small island nation, will become a dominant world power. Even though the English Bill of Rights was only for the rich, they could not ignore the ideas or the wishes of the normal, average, everyday Joe. Public debate, public free speech were things that simply just did not happen on the continent. And the system that Walpole put into place brought a peace and prosperity to England that allowed them to focus on trading from their empire in North America all the way to India. And so, as a result, they formed the empire on which the sun never sets. Next up, we're headed to France.